So you just bought your first Sony PVM and you don't know where to start. Well, this video's for you. So first thing you want to consider is getting some power to your PVM. So let's turn the monitor around. Here's the back of the monitor. Here's where the power goes in. Any traditional computer plug that are still made to this day will work just fine. So you just grab yourself one of these, plug it in, and plug the other end into an outlet. When you do plug the other end into an outlet, you want to consider what else is plugged into that outlet. You don't really want a lot of strange electrical pullings from that same circuit of your house. It can cause some weird things. So if you can avoid bigger things like a computer or something like that plugged into the same power strip, I would do that. I would also recommend plugging the monitor directly into the wall. So that's just something to consider. It might not make a difference, but that's just my recommendation. And so when we look at the back here, here's our inputs. This is composite, which is like a regular input like this. This yellow RCA cable would be like what we call composite. And so that goes here or here for line A or line B. And so you can see this doesn't connect into here. You need what's called a BNC to RCA adapter. So I'll show you what that looks like. Here's one of those BNC to RCA adapter. These just go here. They you push on and then turn them to the right, and they kind of lock into place. And then you can plug your composite right into there, and that's how that works. And then you have your audio, which you can plug in here. It says in, or actually it would be right here. So that's where you would plug it for this input. And it says out, but you can actually plug your other stereo audio input into the out, and that'll feed both of the audio signals into the one speaker that this has, the mono speaker. So that's composite. So there's actually differences in quality between composite, S-video, component, and RGB. And composite is what I would consider the worst quality. Some people prefer composite because it's kind of blurry and they prefer the look of the dithered colors, which some people like. I personally don't. I would consider composite the worst, and I would say if you have a Sony PVM that you're really doing a disservice to your Sony PVM by using composite. I would definitely recommend at least S-video or RGB or component. So this is where the S-video would plug in. I'll show you what one of those looks like. Here's an S-video cable. So you just look at this and match it up on here and plug it in. And you're in. Same thing with the audio. You can plug one into the in and out, and it'll feed both your stereo into the mono speaker of the PVM. So S-video is a huge jump up in picture quality and color vibrance and just colors in general from the composite. So S-video is a great choice, but once again, if you have an awesome PVM like this, I would highly recommend using RGB or component, this bottom row of inputs. Your PVM might have 2 rows of RGB and component inputs. Either way, I would recommend going this route. So the next step in quality from S-video, I would say, is component. It's super similar to RGB, but how do we connect component into here? I'll show you. So this is what most component cables look like, and you got your RGB right here to the left, and then to the right you got your stereo sound cables, and these are RCA again. And so if you look here, it says RGB, or that RRY. RY is like another way of saying red for component. Y is the green for component, and BY is the blue for component. And so you're going to need 3 of the RCA, or the BNC to RCA adapters to connect your standard component cable to the PVM. So that's how you do it. You just plug them in like that. Plug in red, green, blue. Boom. That's how you plug component in. Once again, you have your sound here. Go like that. That's for component. And the other option would be RGB. A lot of times RGB cables just use BNC connectors. So I'll show you what that looks like. Here's the other end of a RGB cable that's plugged into the mister. Once again, if you get a really nice PVM like this, I would highly recommend going the RGB route. That's how you're going to really see the impressive quality of a monitor like this. So these are straight BNC. They just go on easily like this. R, G, B. And then with RGB, there's another one called sync. And so you're going to need to plug another one into sync. So sync can come in H and V sync, horizontal and vertical sync. But for most game consoles, or I think all game consoles, there's only composite sync, which is sent here. So typically you're only going to have one sync, and it looks like this. And this is just the cable I'm using, which is connected to my mister, and I have it set up for composite sync, so that's sent through this wire. So this one is not necessary. So I would recommend hooking yourself up with RGB and sync. And let's take a look at the front of the monitor now. So here's the front of the monitor. We have RGB and sync hooked up. And something to consider is when you are using RGB, you want this selected for RGB. And then I believe, yeah, you also need this selected. And then you need external sync clicked on, because without it, it doesn't sync. Then when I click external sync, we get synced. But if you're using component, you don't want external sync clicked, because as we discussed, component is just sent through the RGB cable. It doesn't have an external sync. So when you're using component, make sure that that's not lit up. And when you're using component, make sure the component button is lit up. If you have wrong colors looking like this is typically because the monitor thinks you're in component, but you're actually in RGB, so it looks like that. So once I select the correct input of RGB, the colors look correct. Now, one other thing to go over for the basics of owning a Sony PVM is when you set up your consoles on the monitor versus when someone else sets up theirs, the main difference that we see a lot of times is a horizontal shift. And on these Sony PVMs or the Olympus or any ones that look like this in the front, it's really easy to adjust your horizontal center, because that's probably the biggest thing we're going to want to change between users or consoles. Here, I'll show you how to do it. You hit menu, and then you hit enter and degauss at the same time. So let me do that. Enter and degauss at the same time. And now we're in what's called the service menu. And don't adjust anything in here unless you know what you're doing, because it can cause problems. So I'm going to find video phase for 60. And if I adjust the value up and down, you can see how the screen is scooting left and right. So that's an important thing to know how to do. See, I'm scooting it left. Now I'm scooting it right. I'm just pressing down and up to adjust the value here, and that scoots it left and right. And that's probably the most commonly used geometry adjustment that you're going to need, because this is just how analog signals are. When you switch consoles, when you switch different setups, they're just scooted left and right. It's just a thing that happens. And you might even find you want to stretch the screen vertically or move it up and down a little bit. That's all within here too. So if we press these buttons here up and down, we cycle through the menu. So see, like 60 for V size. So now if I press the up and down, it stretches the screen bigger or smaller and bigger. So that's just something helpful to know. All right, I feel like that covers pretty much everything. Yeah, I think we're good. If that covers the basics of owning a PVM. When you're in RGB mode, you're not gonna have aperture, bright will make an adjustment, but aperture, chroma, and phase don't make any adjustments when you're in RGB mode, because they're sent what you would call, I guess, the correct amounts of those when you're in RGB. So you're just gonna have contrast and brightness. Oh, here, I'll go over another good thing to know. Bring up this screen in the 240p test suite, and you can see down in this right corner, if I adjust the brightness, see how I can see these lines here, this line and this line. Now I turn brightness down and they go away. This is just a quick and easy way to adjust your brightness. You only want to be able to see this line. So it's just barely there. And that is a pretty good way to adjust brightness and for the colors to be accurate and the blacks to be black. So that's that. I would not recommend cranking your contrast to the fullest. I would put it a little lower. You'll notice that as your contrast goes up, the focus of the beam gets less focused. So like that's contrast down, that's contrast up. So just find a happy medium. But yep, that covers, oh, you know what, here, let me talk about one more thing when we're in a different mode. But I would recommend RGB or component, but if you're not in RGB, let me just talk about something else real quick. All right, so I unplugged the RGB and I put an S-video connection. So that's what this looks like. Just this C selected is how we get S-video on the screen. And I just wanted to talk about these adjustments here. Aperture, which is like sharpness basically on most sets. So this is it down all the way. And then this is me turning it to the right. And this is it turning back down. You see how there's some like white artifacts on his collar? And when we turn it down, they go away. In general, I would recommend keeping aperture basically all the way to the left. In my opinion, it looks a lot better. It's hard to tell on the video, but here's it to the left, here's it to the right. It just adds all these artificial sharpening of, and there's like artifacts on the screen when you have aperture up. So I would recommend that down. We talked about how to set brightness correctly. And then here's chroma. Chroma is how much color is on the screen. So like black and white versus oversaturated. And on this one, keeping it kind of clicked up in the middle, right in the middle is perfect. But you can kind of get used to seeing images online and see what looks correct. Like this is way wrong, way too much. This is right in the middle, which looks good. So you want to have that pretty much set in the middle. Phase is like pushing the color more green or more purple. So like here's to the left, here's to the right. Again, this one right in the middle is what I would consider perfect. So it's probably in the middle for you. but this is just something you kind of have to get familiar with other images with and set it right in the middle. We talked about where contrast is good, and I think that pretty much covers all the basics of everything of owning a PVM. Can't really think of anything else that really matters or that you'll run into when you're just using it in regular use. So feel free to leave any comments if you have any questions. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.